Think about a city designed for busy streets, technological advancements, and layers of flourishing businesses. Without the infrastructure of the city, those things can't happen. Now let's think about one of those businesses, one that's designed to evolve and succeed, always adapting to new innovation. Without basic business fundamentals, this won't happen. Let's make it even simpler. Just one of those people, someone in the business. They're designed to thrive within the relationships that they build. But without a solid framework of attributes like communication, trust, or respect, this also can't happen. All designs need a strong framework, and that includes us.
All right, hey, good morning, everybody. I love coming here every week, partly because it's my job, but I also really love my job. I love hanging out with you guys. But also because, we solve the world's problems here. And I don't know if you caught this. Mike just explained to us exactly where the cutoff is for young adults. I mean, this is like a lifelong quest here to try to figure that stuff out, and Mike just nailed it like that, so it's super awesome. I'm glad you're here this morning. We're really excited to see you. The other thing that Mike mentioned was about baptism. That baptism video reminds me, it's such a joy to see adults follow Jesus and get baptized. I mean, there's something exciting, but it's always exciting whether they're kids or students or whatever, but really something exciting about seeing adults follow Jesus. If you're a believer in Jesus and you have not yet been baptized, there are 1,000 reasons why you shouldn't do this, but there's a couple really good ones why you should. And one of them is just simply to follow Jesus. And two is that I've never heard anyone actually say, I regret following Jesus and getting baptized. Just no one's ever said that. They come up out of the water and it's the exact opposite. They're so excited. They say things like, I just can't believe I waited that long. So if that's you, we would love to have a conversation with you. We had a baptismal here. You notice the past tense of that, right? So it was R.I.P. It's gone, and so it has no longer been able to inflate again. And so, good news is that so it doesn't help us for what we need it for. But the good news is we're getting a new one, and so when we get a new one, it's going to be a bigger one. It's going to be a sturdier one that maybe you're a little bit more used to, has a little bit of structure to it, fiberglass, wood type thing. So. That's coming, and so maybe we'll celebrate that in March and have a baptismal, so that'd be fun. So, all right, we are in a brand new teaching series here called Framework, and as Taylor mentioned, we all need these kind of sticky relationships to help us thrive, and so we're going to be talking about different things over the course of this teaching series. This morning, we are going to be talking about singleness. Next week, we're going to talk about marriage, then we'll talk about parenting, and then we'll talk about the church in general. So all kind of different facets on this issue of framework. It's important to have this type of framework. Now, I'll say this. Most of us here in the room this morning either have or had some type of plan for the way that you wanted your life to go. Typically, the way this works is this plan starts to form in your high school years or your post-high school years, maybe in your early college years, something like that, in that neck of the woods. And so sometimes people help you to try to form that plan. There are counselors and there are parents and there are a bunch of different people that are speaking truth into your life to kind of help form that plan. Other times, you have kind of this clear idea of what you want to do with your life. And so we have these plans. And they can be good plans, and there can be nothing wrong with these plans. In fact, it's probably a month or two ago now, Michael Hayes, our student pastor, and myself, we actually had the opportunity to sit in at one of our local high schools. They had something called senior exit interviews. It was actually at Connor High School right down the road. And we got to hear some of the seniors talk about what they want to do with the rest of their life. And it was really, really cool to kind of hear them talk. And we have some great students, some great seniors here in the area, and just to be able to hear them talk about what they want to do with their lives. And anytime we hear someone talk about their plans for life, maybe your plans, or you hear someone else talk about their plans, it reveals really what matters to them, like what's important to them. It often also reveals where people find identity and meaning. We as people tend to be identity and meaning seekers, just by nature. And so it's why there can be such heartbreak when those plans that we have in our heads when we are young if those things don't actually eventually happen, there can be a tremendous amount of heartbreak. And it's not usually just because, we didn't fulfill a goal that we wanted to have. It's usually greater than that. It's because we have our identity and our meaning tied to those plans. And so when those plans don't happen, either consciously or subconsciously, we feel like we've lost our identity. We feel like we have lost our meaning. But that not only happens within the context of our career plans. Sometimes attached to those plans actually is our marital status. And so sometimes what happens is we can seek to find identity and meaning in our plans for our lives that have to do with our marital status. And the idea is that we will find that meaning based upon if we are married. And not only if we are married, but maybe if we marry the right person. But here's the thing. Identity and meaning aren't supposed to come from being married or being married to the right person. And yet so much of our culture puts so much pressure on individuals in this area. And the fact is that not only in our Christian culture is this an issue, but even in our culture at large. Like, if I was to ask you the question, who is dating Taylor Swift this morning? There's probably a pretty good chance you would know the answer to that question. It's Travis Kelce, right? Now, some of you would know Travis Kelce prior to Taylor Swift, but some of you, Travis Kelce was not on the radar until Taylor Swift was on his radar, and he was on something like that, all until they were dating. And so, like, there's a sense in which Travis Kelce's identity and meaning is tied up in who he is dating, at least the way that we can see. And there's a danger in our Christian circles that we hold that same idea, that our identity and meaning gets tied up in who we are dating or who we are married to. I want to kind of have a conversation this morning, particularly to those who are single, about this concept of that singleness is good. That your identity and meaning does not need to be tied up in your marital status. And I actually think this is what Paul is trying to drive home in the text that we're going to go to this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So if you have a Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be reading a fair bit of this chapter. If you've never seen 1 Corinthians 7 before, it's going to be a lot of fun, all right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on here in 1 Corinthians 7. We'll actually talk about it a little bit next week probably as well with regard to marriage. But I want to kind of drill down here on seeing how singleness is really a good thing. And 1 Corinthians 7 talks about this. So let me go ahead and read. I'm going to read the first 9 verses, and then I'm going to skip down, and I'm going to read, I think it's the last 6. So follow along with me if you can, 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 1. Paul is talking to the church at Corinth, and they got some things right in their lives, and they got some things wrong. And so Paul's addressing one of these issues. He says this, now for the matters you wrote about. I should probably pause here and say this. You know how sometimes when you read Paul in the New Testament and you're like, Paul, you seem to be jumping around in a bunch of different places. Like these never seem to follow together really well. You can see it here in the text. Paul actually is writing 1 Corinthians in response to a bunch of questions that he has received from the church. And so it's a Q&A time, essentially, as he's writing a response back to the questions. And so he says, now for the matters that you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now, obviously, so far, we're talking about stuff that we're probably more so talking about next week. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Verse 6, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. We'll pause and say this. What is Paul? Paul is single. And so Paul says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that you were all as I am, but each of you has his own gift from God. One has this gift, and another has that. Now, to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Skipping down to verse 29. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, and those who mourn as if they do not, and those who are happy as if they were not, and those who buy something as if they were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. I would, verse 32, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, I told you at the front end, there's a lot going on in this chapter, and so I'm not going to be able to address all these things, and some of this is going to be for next week. And so I read a decent chunks because I wanted you to get like a big overview of what's going on here. So for this morning, we're going to kind of pay attention to the sections, the verses here that are pertaining to singles. And I want to point out 4 specific things about singleness from the text. The first one is this. Singleness and being married are both good gifts. Singleness and being married are both good gifts. Let me be more direct. The gift of singleness is a good thing. Singleness is not an issue to be resolved. It's not a problem in search of a solution. It's not a broken person in need of fixing. In fact, let me be direct to everybody who's single in the room this morning. If you are single, it's a good thing. You are not an issue that needs to be resolved. You are not a problem in search of a solution, and you are not a broken person in need of fixing. And you probably need to hear that this morning. The gift of singleness is a good thing. And Paul talks about it as a good thing. It's almost like he's trying to recruit people to be single. He's like, look, I love this, and it's a good thing. And if God gives you this gift, come along, it's a good thing. Now, it's probably important to point out that the gift of singleness is something that could be for a period of time. It doesn't necessarily need to be for life. It's not necessarily a permanent gift. But I want to assure you that it's a good gift. If a single person sometimes can struggle in their lives, they can experience a tremendous amount of angst because they assume that they are to be married by fill in the blank years old, or they will always be single. Now, this could be the case, but it's just as likely not to be the case. And I want to say something that I think Paul is alluding to in the text. Worse than being single, when you don't want to be single, is being married to a person that isn't going the same direction as you are. And so we have to be careful that if you're single in the room this morning, that you don't rush into something that will actually only be worse than where you are at the present moment, even in realizing that where you are at the present moment actually isn't bad. Because if you are married to a person who is pulling a different direction, it is a very difficult thing. And so if you read through the entirety of this chapter, you will see some pretty direct and challenging content around marriage. But I would suggest to you that as you read that content, there's a couple of ways to apply that. You can apply that if you're married to your present marriage, but you can also apply that if you're not yet married to being single. And I would say the application goes something like this: don't put yourself in a bad marriage by longing for something that you don't need to please Jesus and live a joy-filled life. When I was growing up, we had a midweek ministry at our church called Awana. All right, some of you may have grown up in that back in the day. And I remember we'd have a game time in Awana. And so there was the Awana circle, which would basically, there would be like a square, and then there'd be a circle in that, and then there would be like 4 corners to this. And there'd be a bunch of different games that you'd play, and some of them were running games, and some of them were all these different types of games. One of the other games that we played, we actually have something called the Awana Olympics, where you go and compete against other churches. It feels so Christian culture. But so we did this, and one of the events was called the 4-way tug, which was basically a tug of war with a rope that was tied together. So like it was like a circular type situation. And I remember somebody thought that I would be good at this, which is, I don't know, you really question the judgment of adults. But I was like, I was about as skinny as I was now, but that was really short. So I'm like, can you imagine that as like a 3rd and a 4th grader in this event? And like, I was just like a piece of cloth hanging on this 4-way tug, you know. My feet weren't even on the ground. See, but the whole point of this event you were to pull, and you were to pull to the point to get that rope far enough back that you could then reach back. Someone could reach back and grab the pin, and you would win the event. And everyone would be like, "Yay!" And you know, your church would get points and all that kind of stuff. So I remember doing this event, and the thing about a 4-way tug is that there are 4 teams pulling in distinctly different directions. And so as soon as the whistle goes off, there's 2 people in each team, and they're pulling, and it's just like, it's hilarious to watch because it's just people being, you know, pulled and tugged everywhere, and nothing really happening until somebody gets tired enough that somebody usually falls over, and then the team wins. But when I think about that, I think that's what marriage is like when 2 people are headed in different directions. It's a 2-way tug, but it's going the opposite direction. And I want to encourage singles this morning, as you look at a passage like this, that do not make the mistake of putting yourself in a marriage just for the sake of being married, when that is going to pull you in the wrong direction. And you're going to be in that kind of tug environment. Now, I think there's a second teaching point that Paul gives across here that's worth noting regarding singleness, and it's this: the gift of singleness is just as valuable as the gift of being married. The gift of singleness is just as valuable as the gift of being married. Listen, the church is made up of married people and single people, and all people are of great value to it. Now, I want to make sure I say this to address 2 wrong beliefs about marital status. One, that somehow life doesn't begin until you are married, and that you're somehow of lesser value until you are attached to somebody. And that's just not true. I feel like so many times I want to, like, during the course of today's discussion, I want to talk about marriage. But I'm just going to say this just so that you don't get the wrong impression after today. Marriage is a really good thing, all right? So it is a really good thing. I struggle to, like, and I think this is hard because, like, I'm talking this morning about how singleness is a good thing. It's not that I don't mean that marriage is a good thing. Both can be true at the same time. Marriage can be a good thing, and singleness can be a good thing. We probably need to champion that in the church a little bit better. I think we in the church tend to champion the idea that marriage is a good thing, but singleness may not be as good of a thing. But I just want to say both are really good. And your life can be full and great even though you are not married. And the other thing I would say that I'm trying to address in this is that life somehow ends when you are no longer married. And so I would say to those of you in the room this morning who may be divorced or widowed, it's easy to think that you're somehow less valuable to the church or society because you're no longer married. But that is simply not true. I There's a line from a John Mellencamp song. I think it's Jack and Diane. And the line goes like this. Oh yeah, life goes on long after the thrill of living is gone. And I think about that a lot through the years of my interactions with people who have been divorced or who've been widowed and spent so much time with one individual and then to have that change and to feel different. And I think sometimes that those who've gone through divorce and those who've been widowed feel that way. They're like, I'm still living, but a part of my life is not the same, and it doesn't living long after the thrill of living is gone. But I would just simply say to you that if you're feeling that way this morning, just know this, that like God sees you, God loves you, and you are every bit as valuable now to the people in this room and to the people in this community than you were when you were married. And so be encouraged, take hope from that truth. The point is that even though you're no longer married, there's still plenty to this life, even if you might struggle to think that. I actually think the gift of singleness in some ways can breathe life into your life if you will let it. So I want to encourage you to not be discouraged this morning if you're in that situation. The gift of singleness is a great gift. Embrace it. God has lots of things in store for you. And let me say it this way, you don't need to be married to be valuable to God or his church. And that kind of leads me to the main point of what I want to get across this morning. And I've kind of already alluded to this, I've kind of even said it, but if God has you single, you have all you need to be who God wants you to be. If God has you single, you have all you need to be who God wants you to be. So if you're young, or you're divorced, you're widowed, you don't need to be married. You don't need to be dating someone. You don't need to have a different marital status or relationship status to pursue and follow Jesus fully and to experience the joy that Jesus alone gives. Now, there's a third teaching point here that I see in the text in verse 8 specifically. Singleness isn't God's plan B, it's God's plan A for some. Like the way that Paul describes singleness is that it is a great first choice. Like if there could be choices that you could make between singleness and marriage, some people would choose singleness and it would be the right choice, it would be the best choice, it would be the first choice. He says, now to the unmarried and to the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. And so again, I want to plead with us as the church to if we're not doing a good job at this, to maybe do a little bit better job with this idea. And too many times we look around at single people like they are automatically missing out on God's plan for their lives because they're not married. But if you are single, you are not missing out on pleasing Jesus. You're not missing out on serving him. You're not missing out on the blessings that God has for you. And I, as a person that likes to put my foot in my mouth on occasion, I can appreciate how sometimes we as the church say things that we intend to try to be helpful to people, but aren't always helpful to people. And we do this with singles. So we tend to try to automatically try to set singles up with other people in the church. And we tend to think that's helpful. And I mean, there may be occasions where that's helpful, but if that's all we do, or if that's the majority of what we're doing, we're really sending a message that like somehow that person's not valuable till they get with somebody else, which is not helpful. And I'm not trying to, some of you here this morning are trying to set other people up. I'm not trying to create difficulties with you. I'm just saying, like, let's think about the way that we look at that. And when we say things to people, we have to make sure that we say things in such a way that we are actually being biblically faithful. We do not want to try to create some type of subconscious desperation narrative for singles and feed into that, as though somehow they're lesser or they've not really arrived in life until they've actually married somebody else or they're dating somebody else. That stuff doesn't do well. And then we say things like, just be patient and God will give you the right one. And that in a vacuum, that statement's not necessarily bad, but within our Christian culture, with all this other baggage that we sometimes put on it, it can subconsciously tell people that they're not experiencing God's plan A, which is not true. We have to remember that Paul and Jesus were both single and both thrived. Paul was used by God to write so many of the letters of the New Testament where we find so much rich theology, where we've been helped tremendously. And Jesus is the sinless Son of God and the Savior of the world. Like, if neither Paul nor Jesus needed to be married to experience God's plan A. So if we look at the scriptures and we see people there single thriving and being used by God as the cornerstone of the church, and we look at singles in our church and go, you really haven't arrived until you're married, I think we're being inconsistent with the text. If God has you single, you have all you need to be who God wants you to be. Now, your future may well include being married. And if that's the case, that's great. But that relationship isn't needed for you to pursue and follow Jesus. All right, number 4. Singleness has its advantages. Singleness has its advantages. Jacob's laughing, but we all, everybody who's married understands this. Singleness has its advantages. Like, marriage has its advantages, but singleness also has its advantages. And Paul points that out, starting in verse 32, he says, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And those of you who are married know that. And Paul's not saying, by the way, that that's a bad thing, that you shouldn't be that. He's saying that that's actually a good thing to do that. And by the way, we not only have our spouses to concern ourselves with, we have children. And anybody who has children knows that children take up time. And now, like, our joy and our excitement and our spiritual life becomes a part of, like, how we care for our spouses. And this is a discussion for next week. And how we care for our children, that's a discussion for 2 weeks down the road. But, like, singles don't actually have that to concern themselves with. They can actually really focus on the Lord and making hay for the kingdom in ways that married people and people with children cannot. And so in essence, Paul talks up marriage in this text, but he also talks up more so singleness. He says that it has its advantages because a single person can be focused on the Lord in ways that a married person cannot be. Again, we look at the life of Jesus and the life of Paul. The freedom that they had was incredibly helpful to advancing the kingdom. And so singleness has its benefits. Singleness has its advantages. And before you get discouraged about all the things that you think you don't have because you aren't yet married, you should also point out to yourself all the advantages that you do have as a result of being single. One of the challenges in life, by the way, this is true for singles, it's true for married people, it's true for everybody across all sections, young, middle-aged, older, whatever it is. A general principle for us as Christians in any area of our lives, including our marital status, is to focus on what we have, where we are now, and what we can do where we are now, instead of focusing on what we don't have now and what we cannot do now. And this is a problem that we have in our culture. It's a problem that we face with Christians as well. All right, let me give you 3 takeaways this morning. We've gone through 4 teaching points. Let me give you 3 takeaways that you can take and apply to your lives regarding this topic of singleness. Number 1, don't let your marital status define you. And this can be a challenge, by the way, whether you are married or single. But for the believer in Jesus, our identity is tied specifically to the fact that we are a follower of Jesus. Our identity is tied specifically to Jesus. The idea that Jesus lived a sinless life, went to the cross, died on the cross, rose from the dead, defeated death and defeated sin. He's made a way for us to be forgiven and right with him. And that when we put our faith and trust in him alone, our identity is now tied up in him. We are tied up in Jesus. And so it's not in our marital status. It's actually in the fact that we are related to Jesus that we have our identity. So don't let your marital status define you. Number 2, you need to enjoy the place where God has you now. If you're single, enjoy being single. I'd argue if you're married, enjoy being married. If you're married with children, enjoy being married with children if they're young. If they're adults, enjoy being married with children who are adults. In every area of your life, enjoy the place where God has given you, because that place is a gift. I struggle. This is one of the things that I've really asked the Lord to help me with. Because when you're young, when you're in high school, you're just trying to get out of high school, okay? So this is what you're trying to do, just trying to find the fastest way to get out of high school. And then you get in college, and you love college. You think college is the greatest thing ever. But you're like, I want to get on with my life. I want to get on with my career. And so you graduate, you get on with your career, and then you're like, oh, I can't wait till I move up here and do this. And for me, I graduated from college, and then I was like, oh, I can't wait to be in ministry. And then I was in ministry, and then I was a youth pastor, and I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to be something other than a youth pastor. And then so I went on and did some other stuff, and then I'm like, I can't wait to be a lead pastor. And then you're just always looking. And the thing is that if you don't learn to enjoy what God has given you in the moment that you're in currently, you're going to spend all this time looking forward and looking back and looking forward and looking back. And it's part of this whole marital status situation. Enjoy singleness as you're single. And if that's what God, if that's God's gift for you for all your time on this earth, awesome. It will be fulfilling and joyful and exciting. But if something changes down the road, just enjoy where you are at the present moment. All right, I'm talking to end up. Third thing, pursue Jesus right now. Pursue Jesus right now. There's no better place than right now to pursue Jesus. There's no better time to pursue Jesus than right now. If you're single, there's no better place than right now to pursue Jesus. And I would say this, develop spiritual disciplines now that you will want to have the rest of your life. Because there are some people that are married this morning that wish that they would have spent their single years differently. That they wish they would have developed some disciplines differently. I encourage you to develop those disciplines. Establish being a person of prayer. Establish being a person of the scriptures. And understand and be an example and model of what it looks like to be a true friend to others. One of the things that the church needs to do well with is having singles and married people alike who are good friends with each other. We need that type of stickiness. We need that type of connection. We need that type of relationships. If God has you single, you have all you need to be who God wants you to be. Pursue Jesus and follow Jesus.